confirm that we're good? We're good? Okay.
Yep. Good.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I am Mark Newman. As you can see, my pandemic hair is a little bit longer than my profile picture. I'm a professor in the School of Information at University of Michigan. I have a courtesy appointment in computer science. My home field is human-computer interaction. So that's historically sort of an intersection of computer science, psychology, and design, although in sort of the last decade or so, it's really expanded to include a broader swath of social science, and it's quite a diverse, multidisciplinary field. But the core concern of the field is understanding how people interact with computers, how sort of the aspects of human psychology and social context influence the interaction with computers, and then how can we use that information to design more effective computing applications that serve people's needs and allow them to do what they need to do. I'm going to start out by just kind of pointing out what I imagine is something that we're all aware of, which is that it's difficult to design applications, devices, and systems that people use effectively, that people will stick with, and so on and so forth. So just as a couple of data points, these particular data are a little old, but the general principle still holds. The vast majority of health apps that are available commercially are only used once or abandoned very quickly thereafter. Various reports of fitness tracker abandonment range from, there's actually other reports that range from 30 to 60% of fitness trackers are abandoned, or sort of depending on how you define abandonment and how you set the time frame and so on and so forth. And so the question that's facing us as mobile health researchers and developers is, how do we design mHealth technologies so they don't end up in the back of a drawer, whether metaphorically or actually in the back of a physical drawer? And so the solution, or the approach that I'll be talking about today, and really just sort of scratching the surface of, is that there are approaches and techniques that we can use to try to optimize the user experience through an approach that I'm going to call, I'm not going to call it, it's called user-centered design. And the basic approach is fairly straightforward. Start out by understanding your users, produce the best designs you can, prototype those designs effectively and efficiently, and evaluate those designs with your users, and then iterate and go back and do it again, and sort of do it as many times as you can with the time frame and budget and resources that you have available. So what I'm going to focus on today is really the process that is used in what is increasingly called in the industry the field of user experience, but it has gone by many names throughout history. And the fundamental concept in the design process that I'm going to talk about is the principle of failing fast and learning from your mistakes. So I will start by noting that there is a lot of design advice out there. There's a lot of principles, and because of the sort of short format of the talk today, I'm not going to dwell on the principles of design. I will provide some resources at the end of the talk, books and resources for where you can go and get that. But regardless of whether or not you have a strong command of design principles, human psychology, and so on and so forth, you're not going to get it right, because no amount of device or principles is going to allow you to produce a perfect app that meets users' needs right out of the box. And so your goal then is to get it wrong as quickly as possible and as often as possible, and learn from your mistakes so that you can get it less wrong each time you sort of go around the track. And you're always narrowing in on something that is going to satisfy your users' needs and deliver the value or motivate the behavior that you're trying to get. So one way to depict this, so this is sort of the general idea of iterative design. So instead of thinking of design as sort of a timeline that goes from time 0 to time n, and you sort of, chug through it in a linear process, you want to think of this as a cyclical process where you're designing your ideas for what it is that you think your users need and want, building prototypes to embody those ideas in a form that you can put in front of users, that you can put in front of various stakeholders, evaluate those, evaluate the designs, usually in the form of a prototype, take what you learn from that and go back through it again and improve the design, build new prototypes, improve your prototypes, continue, do more evaluation, and do that until you get to the point where you either feel like you've got the best product you can to release, or more realistically, you run out of time and you have to release whatever it is that you have that is the best that you could do under the circumstances. I'll also add that typically we want to start not with design, but we want to start with a process of understanding our users, what their needs are, what their constraints are, what the contexts are in which they're operating, so that when we start our design process, we're starting from a position of really understanding who we're designing for and what it is that they need to be doing. So I'm going to sort of I'm going to go through this step by step. So we're going to talk about understanding your users, talk about the design phase, prototyping, and evaluation, and then I'm going to wrap up. So understanding our users, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do this. Often we employ qualitative methods, interviews, observations, sometimes quantitative methods like surveys, although I will say that qualitative approaches often have this additional benefit of not only understanding things about your users, but helping you to develop empathy with your users, seeing things through your users' eyes, so that when you're envisioning the use of a design concept that you come up with, you have a much better sense of, okay, is this going to resonate? Is this going to work? The sort of data that you can get, demographic data, behavioral data, attitude data, and things like that, is much more difficult to translate into effective designs. Some techniques for mobile health in particular that can be particularly promising. Experience sampling method, so also called EMA when it's used for assessing self-report data and things like that. But the basic, interrupting people throughout their day and asking them questions about what they're doing, who they're with, what decisions they're making, and things like that. See a lot of that. That could be very useful. Diary studies are also useful. And this is because a lot of times in mobile health, we may be trying to understand how health decisions or behavioral decisions are integrated with people's daily lives, and they can be sort of more difficult to observe unless you can follow people around 24 hours a day, and also maybe sometimes difficult for people to recall in interviews. But interviews and these types of techniques are often used in conjunction. So then, you do your formative research, you've got your interview data, you've got your diaries or whatever it is, and you want to make sense of that. So traditional qualitative analysis methods like iterative coding or theory-based coding are often used and can be quite productive. However, in the design field, people have developed other techniques that can be useful for other situations. So for example, affinity diagramming, which I'm not going to go into in great detail here, but the basic idea is it's a collaborative kind of coding where people get together, the design team gets together, takes data, quotes, and things like that, and just kind of groups it into themes. So very similar to what you would do in a more formal qualitative analysis approach. However, it's typically done collaboratively. It's done quickly, maybe in a 2 to 3 hour session, and you get a rapid sense of kind of what your users are and what the issues are that were raised and things like that. So it has the benefit of being, sort of both faster and more efficient. but also collaborative and getting the whole design team on board. And then there are other techniques. There's one called empathy mapping. This is actually a screenshot from a recent study that I've been involved in, where we were asking people about their current physical activity behaviors and dietary behaviors and things like that. And in addition to performing sort of the standard qualitative analysis, we performed an activity called empathy mapping, where basically you sort of take what you've learned and heard from your users and group the themes and concepts and quotes into what do they hear, what do they think and feel, what do they see, what do they say, what do they do. And that sort of gives you a sense, not just of, what the, sort of themes or categories of behavior are, but what are they telling you about their context, about their lives, about the things that matter to them. And the purpose of this is really to develop this empathy where you can sort of see through your user's eyes. And so then when you're evaluating different design approaches, you're doing it from that perspective. Taking that data and making it relevant to design. I mean, one approach is when you have something like affinity diagramming, you may end up with categories, and these could turn into features of your app. So users are telling us they need this, and they're telling us they need this, and so those become functional categories of things that you would want to include in your app. But also that issue of representing the users and sort of making the user's perspective relevant and fresh and impactful in the design context. Designers have developed a number of techniques for doing that. One technique that's quite common is this idea of personas. And what a persona is it's essentially a fictitious composite of a sector of your user population. So here would be an example. So Mary is not a real person. Mary is not one of our interview subjects or anything like that. I mean, obviously that's a picture of a real person, but her name is probably not even Mary. But in any case, we sort of create this character named Mary, who captures sort of the essential factors that would influence how we would think about designing a piece of technology. So what are her motivators? What are her demographics? So she's a project manager, she's divorced with one child, she's motivated by professional success, being a good mom, her constraints, she's very busy, limited time, and so on and so forth. She has high technical literacy. And one thing to note about this is, if you do develop personas for your project, you generally don't develop just one persona. You need to think about who are sort of the different clusters of users that you might be working with. So for example, if we were building a fitness app and we had a relatively broad set of users, we might have another persona that represented an elderly gentleman who is retired, has lots of free time, but has low technical literacy, and let's just call him Bob. And then we might be asking questions when we're looking at different design concepts and things like that. Who needs this? Is this for Mary? Is this for Bob? Or is this not for anybody that we actually can envision as part of our user population? Another related technique is the idea of scenarios. And scenarios are basically stories that take your personas through the use of an envisioned application or a design concept. It sort of tries to tell the story of how this would solve a need or solve a problem that they have. So here's just an example of a story. And we have a hypothetical app called Healthy Heart here, which is going to be sending activity suggestions. And so we have the story about Mary returning to work after a heart attack. She's struggling to incorporate regular physical activity. She started using this Healthy Heart app. And then there's a story about, a particular day in Mary's life as Mary's finishing her meeting. Activity tracker indicates that Healthy Heart has sent her an activity suggestion. It kind of goes on from there. And so this is an attempt to kind of tell yourself and to tell everybody who's involved in the design process a story of how would this concept lead to success for the user. So some just notes about this. So personas and scenarios are ways of representing the data. So these are something you would do as part of formative research to try to bring the data to life and make it relevant for design. Again, these are fictional. They're usually composites, so you might take characteristics of different actual potential users that you talk to. They're interpreted, so you really have to, kind of think about what it means and put some stakes in the ground. They should be representative. They are often, in many cases, idealized. You don't want to make them, sort of too. It's a fine art of making them like really specific and realistic versus kind of something that could capture a more general concept. And the advantages are these artifacts can help to surface assumptions. The process of generating and negotiating these personas and scenarios can help the design team or the research team or all of the stakeholders come together on, well, what do we think? Who do we think we're designing this for, and what are their characteristics? And that can help to build a shared vision of the product that you're ultimately developing. These can also help to focus design discussions, because inevitably you're going to get into discussions about, how should we do this, or how should we do that, or should we add this feature, or those kinds of things. And those discussions can go lots of different ways, because people will have their own opinion. I wouldn't do that, or I would use that. But if you can ask the question, well, would Mary use this feature? Would Bob use this feature? And the answer is no, then that can help to sort of prune off directions that you might go that otherwise would be distraction and consume resources that could be better spent elsewhere. And that's one example of this, is avoiding the corner case trap. It's very easy to get into discussions about something that might happen in rare cases for the unusual individual. And it may not be worth the effort of designing for that rare case when you have sort of bigger fish to fry with your primary populations. Okay, so now we've done our formative research and we've thought about different ways of making the data relevant to the design process. Now we need to go about the work of actually coming up with some design concepts that we could then eventually turn into an app or a piece of technology or something like that. And the first thing is, you never have to start from scratch. Anytime you build anything, it's very unlikely that you're building something that nobody has ever built anything like ever before in the history of technology. So we can follow the advice of Pablo Picasso, who may or may not have actually said this. There's some debate on the internet about that, but it's a pretty good quote anyway. Good artists copy and great artists steal. And I'm, of course, not advocating copyright violations or anything like that. But I am suggesting that there's been a lot of work that's been done, some of it good, some of it bad, and a lot of it somewhere in between. And so when you're coming up with a new concept for an app that you're developing, a device that you're developing, or something like that, the first thing you might want to do is go and gather examples of all of the other things that are like it. And sometimes you want to even look a little bit beyond what is exactly like it, and look for inspiration in sort of neighboring areas and things like that. This technique is often called competitive analysis among in the design community, the UX community, but it really isn't just for competition. So, a lot of times if we're building mHealth apps, if we're going to be using them in a research study, we're not per se competing with other things that are out there, although if we want them to be successful and achieve market success or even just widespread adoption, we do need to think about that. But the point is that this analysis is not just for competition and figuring out how to beat the competition, but also just a way of kind of seeing, well, what's out there, what features are included in the kinds of things that we're planning to do, what features are standard. Is there a good reason that people include these different pieces and functionality? Just from our own perspective, what do we think works? What's good? What's bad? You can identify design patterns. What works and what doesn't. How are different commercial apps that are out there onboarding their users? So how are they getting them started and up and running? And are there things that we could learn from that we could use in our own app development? So here's just an example. Let's say you wanted to build something that had a component where it gives people feedback on their data in some kind of dashboard form. well, let's, maybe this was actually just a Google image search I did for fitness dashboards and found, a bunch of examples. And we can start to compare the different approaches that are being taken. You've got like a very data heavy approach down here. You've got really simple mobile friendly visualizations here. And you can start to think about, well, what would make sense for our context and our users? Whoops. So given that inspiration, now we need to start thinking about what our app is going to have in it, what it's going to look like. And the first thing that designers will do, or even non-designers that are doing design, is sketching out ideas. And sketching on paper with pen and pencil or on a whiteboard, even in our digitally rich environment, is still an incredibly valuable thing to do. So sketches are fast, cheap, and disposable. We don't want to get too attached to our ideas when we're getting started. So they can be generated. Quickly, and then if you make one and you don't like it, you just wad it up and throw it in the recycling bin. They can be very effective for rapid communication among the development team, design team. See, well, what makes sense, what doesn't. And also just worth noting that, in case you had a bad experience in art class in high school or something like that, the kind of sketching that we're talking about doesn't require what you would normally think of as drawing skill. You're not trying to draw a bowl of fruit or a profile of your spouse or anything like that. You're just kind of drawing out, what's on the screen. A lot of it is text, a lot of it is standard widgets and things like that. So there's nothing to be intimidated about there. Very important concept, especially in early design when you're in the sketching stage, is that you generally want to prefer quantity over quality. And what that means is that you're going to be better off generating lots of different ideas. So given some time frame, you're better off using that to create lots of different ideas rather than working on and refining one idea and making it perfect. So there's this great story that often gets circulated. A professor at somewhere, I think a Midwestern university, was teaching a ceramics course and told half of the students that they would be graded based on the number of pieces that they complete, and then told the other half that they would be graded on the best piece that they created. And then at the end, they brought in experts, I guess other professional ceramicists, and had them judge the work. And you can probably guess where this is going, because I probably wouldn't be telling you this story otherwise. But the people in the graded on the number of pieces that you complete were judged to have significantly better work. So not just more work, but better work than the ones who were graded based on their best piece. And the idea there is that by iterating through lots of different ideas and feeling like, okay, not all of these have to be perfect, you actually can come up with better ideas, better work than if you just try to polish, the first idea that you have. Now, this can be difficult. So generating lots of ideas can be hard, especially if this is not something that you spend most of your time doing. Avoiding attachment to ideas is hard also. So especially you come up with an idea, you really like it, you get excited about it. There's a very strong temptation to sort of stick with that and push it. And that can lead to tunnel vision and cause you to not see opportunities that are right nearby. And it's also easier, especially when in discussions with other people, to find flaws in especially early concepts than it is to produce ideas. And so to combat this, there's a bunch of techniques that often fall kind of generally into the category of lateral thinking techniques. Many of you have probably been exposed to these in one form or another. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but the point is to just, to kind of be aware that, sometimes it can be difficult to, sort of go with this quantity over quality concept. And so applying techniques like, classic brainstorming, the 6 thinking hats technique was one of the early brainstorming techniques, various kinds of sketch storming. So for example, there are exercises like 20 sketches in 20 minutes. You just set a timer and you say, I'm going to, fill this page with, 20 sketches, different ideas. Come up with the worst idea that you can think of. That can often lead to kind of a different way of looking at the problems and so forth. And one way to think about this is that the design process overall, not just the early stage when you're sketching ideas, I find it valuable to think of it as a process or a set of processes that are interwoven of divergence and convergence. And it's often useful to be asking yourself at any particular point in the design process, is what we're doing divergent? Are we trying to create more ideas? Are we trying to explore the space? Are we trying to, sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom? Or is what we need to do right now converge and make some decisions and actually narrow the space down, right? And this is actually something that you kind of want to do, multiple times, right? So you might start out with sketching. You want to start out with lots and lots of ideas, but then you want to use that to narrow down and say, okay, what are our criteria? What are we going to, decide upon? And then, in the next stage, you might say, okay, given that we have this, set of features, well, what are the different ways that we could possibly deliver those? And what are some different interaction techniques and how would that look? And then you got to make decisions, and then you can say, okay, well, what are the different ways it can be presented visually? What's our color scheme? What's our fonts? All that kind of stuff. So I think it's just useful to kind of be thinking that you need both, right? You need times when you're expanding what your thoughts on what you could be doing, and then there's times when you're trying to sort of bring it back under control, because ultimately you do need to end up with a product at the end. So prototyping, so once we've come up with designs, we've narrowed it down, we have a pretty good idea of what we think, where we think we want to go, at least provisionally, at least for now. We want to build a prototype or prototypes to really get a sense of, okay, how would this work? Is this going to make sense? And ultimately to ideally get feedback from users on it. So prototype, I think everybody has an intuitive notion of it, but we could just say that it's a simulation or sample version of a final product, which is used for testing prior to launch. So it's important to distinguish sketches from prototypes, because sketches are not necessarily a version of a final product. It might just be a tiny little bit. It might be a storyboard that is just like a cartoon of how people would do something. Whereas a prototype is supposed to be, like a version, perhaps a very rough, very early version of the product, which is in a sense a proposal for what the product might be. There's multiple reasons to prototype, and this can be important, especially if you're working with, for example, developers and graphic designers and things like that, because people are interested in different things from a prototype, and it's useful to be clear about what a particular prototype is supposed to accomplish. So, for example, you can have technical prototypes, which are really just about, can this thing work? Are we able to, make this particular feature work? Are we able to, integrate the machine learning backend, so that it actually, produces the recommendations for our, activity recommender or something like that. And that might not have any, user-facing components at all, right? There's other kinds of prototypes that are really about the look and feel, that might be about, sort of different graphical presentations, different, animation and things like that. And then there's the behavioral prototypes, which are the ones that I'm going to be focusing more on here, because I think those are the ones that are the most related to questions about, is this thing that we're building, does it serve the user's needs? Is it useful? And is it usable? So it may have the features that users need it to have, or it may be able to do the things that people want. But if they can't figure out how to get it to do that, then it's also not going to be a very effective product. So those are sort of different reasons to prototype, and it's important to be clear about what you're trying to accomplish with a particular prototype that you build. And then within that, there are different forms of prototypes. So we can build prototypes that are low, medium, or high fidelity, basically representing how close to the final product they are. We can use different media, paper versus digital. We can build prototypes that are static or interactive, since we're ultimately building interactive technologies. that's a decision that we need to make. So I'll give a couple of examples at different points in the spectrum. So one technique that is commonly used in certain design processes are paper prototypes. And the idea here is you actually build, this is showing an example of, a user interface that's built entirely out of paper, right? This can be very useful, especially for early stage user testing, where you want to get feedback from users. You want to see, if the overall flow or overall interaction makes sense to users, but you don't want to invest very much in the production of the prototype. So this would be an example of a low fidelity but interactive prototype, because typically in paper prototyping, especially if they're used in user testing, you'll have a test moderator or research team member play the computer. So the user, so you see here, like this user is tapping there, doesn't look like they're tapping on a button. So that's not a good example, but let's say they tapped on this button, then the computer might put another piece of paper down there that represents a new screen that would be shown to the user. And then you can kind of walk through the interaction that way. So obviously these are, not going to be very close to what the final product would be, but they are very cheap and fast to produce. Also, interestingly, they're easy to modify on the fly. So you can capture and include user input. So if somebody has like the search box right here, they could just write down what they would put in there. And then, the quote unquote computer could write down the search results. Also, if, a user gets confused or hits a roadblock or something like that, you could just engage in a discussion of, well, what did you expect to see? And you could potentially make modifications right there on the fly. So those are some advantages of paper prototyping. Usually, again, you would use this early in the phase in a project. Digital prototypes are generally used for later stage user testing when you're trying to get, things closer to what the final product would look like. Here's just a couple of examples from projects I've been involved in over the last little while. So here, you have sort of the dimensions of an actual, in this case, an iPhone screen. You could sort of have standard widgets that are about the right size and so on and so forth. So you're getting much higher fidelity. So usually this would be used for, medium to high fidelity prototyping. Many of the tools that are used to produce these nowadays can be made interactive. They're not, fully functional applications by any means or something like that, but you can do things like as shown here. You can define hotspots where somebody taps on something and it transitions to another screen or something like that. There's several tools that are out there that do this kind of thing. All the students in my school seem to be crazy about Figma, which is a very nice tool. It's web-based, very easy to share your prototypes. But you can even do this in PowerPoint. PowerPoint actually has all the features that you would need for this. You can drag and drop common UI widgets, so you're building stuff that looks close to what you would eventually be deploying and so forth. Some trade-offs in prototyping. So you always kind of got to ask, well, how much fidelity? In addition to what's the medium? Are we doing this on paper? We got to do this in a digital tool. So obviously higher fidelity is going to be closer to the product, which means if you use it in user testing, you're going to get feedback on something that's closest to what the app will finally be. That's important to get at some point. However, if you do it too early, you can invest significant cost in potentially ideas that don't really turn out to be the right way to go. You also can avoid, with lower fidelity approaches, premature commitment. So one of the consequences of this higher cost is that it's very difficult to walk back from decisions or paths that you've invested a lot of time and effort and resources into. And so you want to avoid making commitments to these concepts because it can be very difficult to undo them if it turns out that you may have gone in a wrong direction or missed some opportunity. Another advantage of low fidelity approaches is that it often has been shown to focus the respondent or the user on things like the functionality, the usefulness and stuff like that, and not so much on the look and feel. So if you give people a highly polished prototype or an app that's nearly finished, they can talk a lot more about whether they think the animations feel clunky, or whether they think the color scheme is not, resonant for them, or, something like that, which, eventually that might be feedback that you want. But earlier on, you're still trying to figure out, well, what do we need to include, and how is it connected, and how does it need to work? I'm just going to kind of move on since we're running low on time. And so then the final stage, so now we've done design, we've understood our users, we've designed some ideas, we've prototyped them. Now we want to get feedback. So the core method in user-centered design for getting feedback from users, for understanding whether a particular design concept works or doesn't work, is user testing. So the standard user test, you've got users that represent people that have the same characteristics of the people that you will ultimately be deploying to. You got to have a prototype of some kind. It could be a paper prototype, it could be a digital prototype, it could be a fully functioning app, but you got to have something. You got to have a set of tasks that represent the things that people will be doing with your app. I'll talk a bit more about those on the next slide. And then you have somebody to moderate the tests. It's nice to have recording equipment so you can go back and you can look at this, you can share it with other stakeholders. It's nice to have other observers who can take notes, but the minimal set is what's kind of shown here. So the standard user test, you got some introduction, consent forms and those kinds of things. You then have the user walk through the tasks that you've assigned to them. And it's important when designing these tasks that you express them in the user's terms, not system terms. So you don't want to give the name of the button that they're supposed to press, because that sort of gives away the ending. So you usually got to think a little bit, okay, what would the user have in their mind? Not give the leading and not give instructions that are too leading. Ideally, you want to have clear success criteria so you can tell whether or not the user succeeded in the task or failed. So, just an open-ended task like, look for something that you might like on this in this search interface. It's difficult to know whether or not they succeeded, but if you ask them to search for a particular thing, then you can tell whether they found it or not. And of course, you want your tasks to be essential to the successful use of the product. So you want to prioritize the tasks that are really important to, what does it mean for this product to be successful? In user testing, you generally want to ask the user to think aloud. There are some cases where that's not the case, but I think in most sort of this formative usability testing, that's what you would want to do. The basic idea here is that the user describes their thought process as they're interacting with the system. And this becomes data that you can use to understand where they're getting confused, frustrated, and so on and so forth. It's also important that the moderator resists intervening. So the user might say, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do. You really don't want the moderator to jump in and be like, okay, well, no, here's what you do. Because you really want to see if they can solve it, because the moderator isn't going to be there when it's deployed. And then you often want to debrief the participant, review critical incidents. You might collect subjective responses, perhaps ask in an interview, or you could also administer questionnaires. And what's the point of all this? So the user testing outcomes, first you want to see if people succeeded or failed at your key tasks. You might look at the time and steps taken to completion. A lot of times we're not going to be looking for extreme performance and the types of things that we're doing in mHealth. So time isn't a grain of salt, but if it takes somebody 10 minutes to do something that you thought was going to take them 30 seconds, that's interesting information. Did they make any errors? And then a lot of what you're interested in are what is sort of generally called critical incidents. And so this might be places where you, as the observer or the moderator, observe the participant, being confused, frustrated, taking a wrong turn, and then every once in a while, maybe even expressing delight at how wonderful this application is for them. And then what you do with that is you sort of take these problems and try to figure out, well, what in the design might have led to these problems, and then you fix those problems, you prototype, and you test again. Eventually, before you release, you typically want to do alpha or beta testing. So field deployment where you release a working version or early version of whatever the technology is to a small group, often lead users that maybe you have a higher bandwidth of communication with, so that you can get feedback. You need to have, in this case, you really do need to have what we would think of as a minimally viable prototype. So something that could work without supervision. And this is obviously going to be done closer to launch, where you have something that you're considering releasing to your broader user set. One problem that we often have in mHealth, and increasingly and more generally in applications nowadays, is interventions that require some kind of machine intelligence or some kind of more sophisticated operation, where the real question is, well, what is that? What should that intelligence be doing? And how should it work? How reliable does it need to be? And that part of the project could be one of the most expensive and risky parts of the project. And so how do you get feedback on this kind of thing? Well, one technique, sort of broad category of techniques that, that one could consider here are called Wizard of Oz techniques. It's obviously based on the Wizard of Oz, with the man behind the curtain who turns out is actually controlling the wizard. And this actually goes way back, started in the 80s for speech interface prototyping at IBM. And the basic idea is simulating machine intelligence with human intelligence so that you can learn what's needed and what isn't, and then you can incrementally add automation to create the real system. And here's just an example of a project that did this, and I will be wrapping up soon here. I really like this project. I thought it was quite clever. This was done at Intel Research in 2004. And the idea was that they had was to assess the benefits of an active picture frame for adult caregivers of elderly folks. So the idea was to support aging in place. The adult children of an older person could get sort of have this ambient interface that would help them, reassure them of what that their parent was doing okay, or alert them to problems that they needed to attend to. And so the idea was instrument the elder's home with sensors to capture activities of daily living and update the caregiver's display with status info. But the problem is that the technology for detecting activities of daily living with sensors was and still is fairly expensive and error prone, and you really want to know which ones are important, how reliable does it need to be, and all of this kind of stuff, and what kind of information would be valuable to the caregivers. And so what they did in this study is, instead of going and building the whole instrumentation system and then deploying it in dozens of homes, they had research team members call the elders daily, ask a bunch of structured questions, and then use that to update the displays. And from that, they were able to find out, what the caregiver experience was, what the elder experience was in terms of privacy violations, and so on and so forth. And they were able to make progress on sort of what this concept ought to be like, and therefore narrow down the space of what would need to be done, the technical implementation. So I'm going to wrap up and just reiterate. So we talked about this iterative user-centered design process as being fundamental to the concepts to producing applications, technology that have a compelling user experience. Another way to think about this is the spiral model that's often described, because we are, it's not really like we're just going around in a circle, we're actually making progress. But we could think of the progress as, in this example, spiraling in towards a final product. And as we go in, we're increasingly refining the product, we're increasing the fidelity, but we're also increasing our commitment to a particular set of features, a particular design direction. And of course, as we go, we're increasing our investment. So the goal of all of this is to try to reduce risk and improve user experience, so that what we end up with is the best thing that we can come up with, given what our constraints. So takeaways. So poor UX dooms products, and mHealth is no exception, and maybe even harder than some other areas. And user-centered iterative design will increase the quality of your user experience. So we do that by understanding users, designing solutions, building prototypes, evaluating designs, and rinse and repeat ad infinitum. So I'll just plug the, what are we calling these? Ask the experts. But of course, I'd be happy to chat with any of you about any questions that you have before or after that as well. And then in the slides, I've just included some additional resources if you want to go deeper. There's a set of Coursera specializations, online courses, including a specialization that was put together by me, and also features Pedja Klasnia, who you have heard from in an earlier talk. And then here's kind of my my playlist of my favorite UX books. Most of these are a little bit older, but I think still classics. So these, I think the slides will be shared, and if you're interested, those are some things that you can go and check out. And with that, I am done.